The mafia boss's icy composure shattered when his hand locked onto her wrist, not because of the scar, but because the crimson ribbon tied over it was the exact color of his wife's blood-soaked final message. Julian Holt's hand locked around her wrist, his icy composure shattering when his thumb traced the scar that proved she belonged to the same brutal institution that murdered his wife. He dragged the terrified curator toward the private elevators, demanding to know how she acquired the brand and why her face was blank when he whispered the name of his wife's killer, Thorne. Now he had the key to his vengeance, but he had no idea he was locking himself in a room with the next target. But it wasn't just the scar. It was the red ribbon tied around it in a perfect bow, vibrant against her pale skin. "Where did you get this?" His voice dropped to something lethal, something that made the crystal chandeliers overhead seem to dim. "Why did you tie it with the ribbon?" His grip tightened. Not enough to hurt, not yet, but enough that Vivian Reed understood she wasn't leaving this conversation. The mafia boss froze when he saw the red ribbon scar. It matched his wife's last warning. The only thing Anya had left behind before someone put 2 bullets in her chest and staged it as a home invasion gone wrong. The hotel lobby fell silent around them. Even the pianist in the corner seemed to sense the shift, his fingers stumbling over Chopin. "I don't know what you're—" "Don't." He pulled her closer, his Italian suit immaculate, his cologne sharp with bergamot and threat. Behind him, 2 men materialized from the crowd, one silver-haired and expressionless, the other younger with the build of someone who broke bones for a living. "My wife had this exact mark, circle, raised edges. She photographed it before she died. Left it for me with one word: Thorne." Vivi's breath caught. His eyes narrowed. "You know that name." She did. God help her, she did. What Vivi didn't know was that recognizing that name had just sealed her fate, and the truth she was about to reveal would put both their lives in immediate danger. 6 hours earlier, the panic attack hit on the crosstown bus, somewhere between 5th Avenue and the Gallery District. Vivi pressed her forehead against the cool window, counting her breaths the way Dr. Okonkwo had taught her. 4 in, hold for 7, 8 out. The other passengers ignored her. New York had trained them well in the art of selective blindness. 3 months in the city. 3 months since she'd walked away from the prestigious position at the Portland Museum, from the 2 interested questions about her past, from director Elias Thorne's unsettling habit of calling her "my girl" in front of donors. 3 months of building a careful, quiet life where no one looked too closely. The Carlisle Hotel's annual charity exhibition was the kind of event Vivi normally avoided. Too many people, too much champagne loosened scrutiny. But the coordinator, Miranda Lang, had been persistent. "Just a few hours, Ms. Reed. We need someone with your eye for authentication. There's a piece we're uncertain about." This decision to attend would prove to be the worst, and most necessary, choice of her life. The hotel lobby was empty when she arrived, exactly as she'd timed it. The exhibition wouldn't open to guests for another hour. Soft afternoon light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the marble floors into rivers of gold. A Monet reproduction hung above the concierge desk. Water lilies, of course. Hotels always chose water lilies. Safe, uncontroversial, forgettable. Vivi understood the appeal of being forgettable. She moved through the space with practiced efficiency, her leather portfolio tucked under one arm, her cashmere coat folded over the other. The exhibition occupied the East Wing, a careful arrangement of mid-century paintings on loan from private collections. Nothing revolutionary, nothing dangerous. Her hand drifted to her left wrist, an unconscious gesture she'd never managed to break. The scar beneath her sleeve was small, no larger than a quarter, but it had defined every choice she'd made since childhood, since Sister Catherine had held her down in the basement of St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls, while matron Beatrice heated the brand in the furnace. "So we always know who you belong to," the matron had whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint and madness. Vivi had been 7 years old. She'd spent the next 25 years trying to forget, tried to bury it under doctoral degrees and gallery positions and the careful construction of a woman who came from nowhere, belonged to no one. This morning, in a moment of defiance she couldn't explain, she'd tied the red ribbon around her wrist. Found it in a drawer, still vivid after all these years. The ribbon matron Beatrice had given her the day she'd finally aged out of St. Jude's. "A reminder," she'd said, "of where you come from, what you are." Vivi had never worn it. Until today. She couldn't have said why. Some part of her that was tired of hiding, perhaps. Some part that wanted to be seen. That choice, to finally wear the ribbon after 18 years, was about to collide with a man who'd been hunting its meaning since his wife's murder. Miranda appeared from the gallery entrance, her black suit crisp despite the humidity. "Ms. Reed, thank you for coming early. The Rothko sketch is this way." But Vivi had stopped walking. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted, subtly at first, like air pressure dropping before a storm. The concierge straightened behind her desk. The bellhop near the revolving doors adjusted his posture. Even the pianist transitioned from Debussy to something lower, more careful. Then the doors opened. 4 men entered, but only one commanded gravity. He was tall, easily 6'3", with dark hair swept back from a face that belonged on a Renaissance medallion. Sharp jaw, darker eyes, olive skin that caught the golden light and turned it predatory. His charcoal suit was cut with the precision that came from Savile Row tailoring and the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. But it wasn't his appearance that made her chest tighten. It was the way everyone else reacted. Miranda moved toward him without being summoned, her professional mask slipping into something more deferential. The concierge didn't just straighten, she stood. The security guard near the elevator shifted his weight, suddenly alert. A couple examining the Monet reproduction fell silent and moved to the far wall. The man walked through the lobby with absolute authority, flanked by 3 others. The silver-haired one moved like a shadow. Elegant, lethal, probably 60 but fit enough to be dangerous. The younger 2 were clearly muscle, though expensive muscle. Designer suits, discreet earpieces. Miranda reached him first. "Mr. Holt, we weren't expecting you until—" "Is the Vermeer study authenticated?" His voice was low, controlled, with the faintest trace of an accent Vivi couldn't place. Italian, perhaps. Or Greek. "Yes, sir. Ms. Reed is here to provide final verification for—" His gaze swept the lobby and landed on Vivi. For a moment, nothing happened. He was looking at her the way he might look at furniture, assessing, dismissing, moving on. Then his eyes dropped to her wrist, to the red ribbon tied in a careful bow, to the circular scar it couldn't quite hide. Everything stopped. In that frozen moment, neither of them understood they were staring at the same ghost, the same warning, the same enemy. The silver-haired man beside him tensed. The younger guard's hands drifted toward their jackets. Miranda's perfectly trained expression cracked into confusion. Julian Holt crossed the lobby in 4 strides and caught her wrist. "I asked you a question." His thumb pressed against the scar through the ribbon, as if he could resurrect the dead through touch. "Who are you?" Vivi's training kicked in. The same training that had gotten her through doctoral defenses and donor meetings, and every moment someone had looked at her too closely. She met his eyes without flinching, even though her pulse was hammering against his fingers. "My name is Vivian Reed. I'm a curator. I don't know your wife. I don't know anything about—" "Thorne." He said the name like a curse, like a prayer. "Elias Thorne. You know that name." She did. God help her, she did. Every instinct screamed at her to lie, to pull away, to run. But his grip was iron, and the silver-haired man had moved to block the nearest exit. And Vivi understood with sudden, crystalline clarity that whatever she said next would determine whether she walked out of this lobby, or disappeared into the kind of silence that swallowed women whole. "I knew him," she said quietly. "A long time ago." Something flickered in Julian's expression. Not relief, not satisfaction, recognition. He released her wrist, but only to grip her elbow instead. Already turning toward the private elevators, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Then you're coming with me. Because my wife died investigating him, and you're walking around wearing her last message to me like a fucking accessory." The silver-haired man, Silas she would learn later, opened the elevator without being asked. And Vivian Reed, who had spent 18 years being invisible, stepped inside. Because some warnings, once delivered, couldn't be untied, even with a red ribbon. What neither of them realized was that by leaving that lobby together, they'd just triggered an alarm that would reach Thorne within the hour, and he was already preparing his response. If this moment hit you the way it hit me while writing it, take a second to subscribe. It tells me you want more stories like this, and it truly helps me keep making them. Comment where you're watching from, because this story isn't just about Julian's revenge or Vivi's survival. It's about taking on a system that brands children as property and calls it protection. It's about choosing to fight back against people who believe power means ownership. And I want to know, are you team burn it all down, or team there has to be another way? Drop your answer below. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, hidden behind iron gates and old-growth trees that turned the late afternoon sun into fragments of gold and shadow. Vivi watched through the Mercedes' tinted windows as they passed the kind of security checkpoints that didn't exist on any official map. Cameras disguised as birdhouses, motion sensors embedded in decorative stonework, guards who wore tailored suits instead of uniforms. Julian hadn't spoken since they'd left the hotel. He sat across from her in the back seat, his attention fixed on his phone, his jaw tight with the kind of control that came from years of swallowing rage. Silas drove with the steady competence of someone who'd made this trip 1,000 times, his silver hair catching the light every time they passed beneath the canopy of trees. No one had asked if she wanted to come. No one had given her a choice. But what Vivi was about to see in that house would make her grateful she hadn't run. Because the evidence Julian had collected was more horrifying and more complete than anything she could have imagined. The house revealed itself gradually, a modernist masterpiece of glass and steel and Indiana limestone. Perched on a hillside like a sleeping predator, floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the surrounding forest, making it impossible to see inside. The architecture was deliberate, defensive, beautiful, but built for war. The car stopped beneath a portico. Julian was out before Silas could open his door, already moving toward the entrance with the kind of purposeful stride that made Vivi's stomach clench. Silas opened her door, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp enough to catch every micro-expression. "Ms. Reed," he said quietly, extending a hand she didn't take. She climbed out on her own, her portfolio still clutched against her chest like armor. The air smelled of pine and money and something else, gunpowder maybe, or just the ghost of violence that clung to places like this. The front door opened before they reached it. A woman in her 60s stood in the threshold, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her cardigan the color of autumn leaves. She had the kind of face that belonged to everyone's memory of a grandmother, soft, kind, observant in the way that missed nothing. "Mrs. Dwyer," Julian said, brushing past her without slowing. "We have a guest. She'll need the east wing prepared." "Of course, Mr. Holt." Mrs. Dwyer's gaze swept over Vivi with clinical precision, taking in the wrinkled coat, the white-knuckled grip on the portfolio, the carefully blank expression that wasn't nearly as convincing as Vivi hoped. "Should I bring tea?" "Bourbon," Julian called from somewhere deeper in the house. "And the file from my office safe. The red one." Mrs. Dwyer's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Concern, perhaps, or recognition. She nodded once and disappeared down a hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than most people's houses. Vivi stood in the foyer, suddenly aware of how thoroughly trapped she was. The house was beautiful in the way mausoleums were beautiful. All clean lines and expensive surfaces and the careful absence of anything personal. No family photos. No sentimental clutter. Just art and architecture and the kind of silence that swallowed sound. "Coming?" Silas stood beside an open doorway, his tone polite but firm enough that Vivi understood it wasn't really a question. She followed him into what could only be described as a war room disguised as a study. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, a desk the size of a small car. But it was the wall behind the desk that made her breath catch, floor-to-ceiling corkboard covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, maps, and red string connecting dots that told a story Vivi didn't want to read. And there, in the center of that conspiracy wall, was a photograph that would change everything. A picture of Vivi herself, taken years ago at St. Jude's, standing beside girls she'd thought were safe. Julian stood in front of it, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled to his elbows, staring at the chaos like he could solve it through sheer force of will. "Sit," he said without turning. Vivi remained standing. "I want to leave." "No, you don't." He finally turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes was so raw it felt like an invasion. "You want to run. You want to disappear. You've been doing it for years. I can see it in the way you move, the way you dress, the way you tried to make yourself invisible in that lobby. But you can't run from this." "From what? I don't know anything about your wife. I don't—" "Thorne." He said the name like a blade. "Elias Thorne, director of St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls until it closed in 2010. Currently sits on the board of 3 nonprofits, advises 2 senators, and somehow manages to be photographed at every high society function in the Northeast, despite having no visible source of income beyond a modest pension." Vivi's hands tightened on her portfolio. "How do you—" "Because my wife spent the last year of her life investigating him." Julian moved to the desk, his movements controlled but tightly wound. "She was an investigative journalist before we married. Couldn't let it go, even when I begged her to. Said she'd found something. Something that made every story she'd ever covered look insignificant." Mrs. Dwyer entered with a tray. Bourbon in crystal tumblers, the promised file in red leather. She set it on the desk without a word, her gaze lingering on Vivi for a moment too long before she withdrew, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Julian opened the file, extracted a photograph, placed it on the desk facing Vivi. She didn't want to look. Knew she shouldn't look. Looked anyway. The photograph showed a woman's wrist. Pale skin, delicate bone structure, a circular scar identical to Vivi's. But this one was fresh, angry, the surrounding skin still bruised. And tied around it, securing a folded piece of paper to the wound, was a red ribbon soaked dark with blood. Vivi's vision tunneled. "That's the last thing Anya sent me," Julian said quietly. 48 hours before someone put 2 bullets in her chest and burned her research. The only word on that paper? Thorne. He pulled out another photograph. A crime scene this time. Clinical and brutal. A woman who'd been beautiful, now a body on pristine white sheets, her eyes closed like she was sleeping except for the blood spreading beneath her. "I've spent 2 years following cold leads and dead ends," Julian continued, his voice empty of everything except purpose. "Every person she interviewed is either disappeared or refuses to talk. Every document she collected is ashes. Every source she protected is silent. Until you. He moved around the desk, leaning against it, arms crossed, studying her with the kind of focus that dissected lies. So here's what's going to happen, Vivian Reed. You're going to tell me everything you know about Elias Thorne. You're going to help me understand why my wife died with his name on her lips and your scar on her research wall. And you're going to do it willingly. And if I don't? His smile was cold enough to frost glass. Then I'll make sure every law enforcement agency in the country knows you're connected to whatever Thorne is running. That you wore that scar, that brand, to a public event like a calling card. That you ran the moment I confronted you. I didn't run. You kidnapped me. Is that what this is? He gestured around the room, almost casual. Because from where I'm standing, I'm offering you protection. Thorne clearly knows you exist, clearly marked you for something. And when he finds out you've resurfaced, he already knows. The words escaped before Vivi could stop them. Julian went very still. Explain. What Vivi revealed next would prove that Thorne wasn't just watching. He was orchestrating, and they were already several moves behind. Vivi set down her portfolio with shaking hands, pulled back her sleeve, untied the red ribbon with deliberate slowness, letting it pool in her palm like a wound. Matron Beatrice gave me this the day I left St. Jude's, she said quietly. Told me to keep it, that I'd know when to wear it. She met his eyes. 3 days ago, I received a letter, no return address, just 2 words, welcome home. The silence stretched between them like wire. Finally, Julian pushed the bourbon across the desk toward her. Then I guess, he said, his voice soft and lethal. We both have a problem. The bourbon burned going down, but Vivi welcomed it. Anything to ground her in the present, to keep her from sliding back into memories that smelled of bleach and incense, and the particular kind of fear that lived in a child's bones. Julian had given her space after her revelation about the letter. 20 minutes alone in the study while he made calls in the adjacent room, his voice too low to make out words, but sharp enough that she knew heads were rolling somewhere. Silas had positioned himself by the door, silent as a statue, his presence both guard and witness. Mrs. Dwyer had returned with sandwiches neither of them would eat, her eyes lingering on the photographs spread across the desk before she'd retreated with a small shake of her head. Disappointment, maybe, or resignation. The look of someone who'd seen this obsession consume Julian for 2 years and knew it wouldn't end well. Now the sun was setting beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the forest into shadow play, and Vivi was out of time to decide how much truth she could afford to tell. The door opened. Julian entered with another man, younger, maybe 35, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of lean, nervous energy that came from too much coffee and too little sleep. He carried a tablet and moved with the efficiency of someone who lived inside databases. Dean Archer, Julian said by way of introduction. Intelligence. If it exists in digital form, he can find it. Dean nodded at Vivi, his expression cautious but curious. Ms. Reed, I've been running background on you since you entered the hotel lobby. You're remarkably good at being unremarkable. That was the point, Vivi said, clearly. Dean set his tablet on the desk, pulling up files with quick swipes. Born in New Jersey. Parents died in a car accident when you were 5. Placed in state care. Bounced between 3 foster homes before ending up at St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls in upstate New York. Stayed there until you aged out at 18. Julian's gaze sharpened. St. Jude's closed in 2010. State investigation, Dean confirmed, scrolling through documents. Anonymous tip about financial irregularities. By the time investigators arrived, all the records had been destroyed in a convenient electrical fire. Thorne resigned, collected his pension, and somehow landed on his feet. The girls were scattered to other facilities. Most of the staff disappeared. Most? Vivi's voice was steadier than she felt. Dean glanced at Julian before answering. Matron Beatrice Fournier died 6 months after St. Jude's closed. Single car accident on a rural road. No witnesses. The room temperature seemed to drop. Vivi's fingers found the red ribbon in her pocket, the silk cool and accusatory against her skin. Sister Catherine? She asked quietly. Catherine Moreau. Entered a cloistered convent in Vermont. Hasn't spoken to anyone outside the order since 2011. Dean's fingers moved across the screen. But here's what's interesting. In the 3 years before St. Jude's closed, 17 girls aged out of the system. Of those 17, 5 are confirmed dead. 3 are missing. The remaining 9, including you, all changed their names, moved across the country, and built new identities. We were running, Vivi said. All of us. Julian leaned against the desk, arms crossed, his attention absolute. From what? The answer to that question would reveal a trafficking network so sophisticated, so protected by wealth and power, that even Julian's resources had barely scratched its surface. The words caught in her throat. She'd spent 18 years not saying them out loud, not giving shape to the thing that had carved itself into her childhood. But Anya's photograph was still on the desk, that bloody red ribbon, that identical scar. And Vivi understood with sudden clarity that silence was no longer protection. From being found, she said, from being called back. She stood, moving to the window because she couldn't look at their faces while she said it. The forest was dark now, full of shadows that could hide anything. St. Jude's wasn't a home, she began, her voice flat, reciting facts like they belonged to someone else. It was a training facility. Thorne called it refinement, teaching us how to move through the world, how to speak, how to present ourselves. Art history, languages, music. I thought it was education. I was grateful. But, Julian prompted, his tone careful. But there were other lessons. Vivi's reflections stared back at her from the darkened glass, ghost pale and unfamiliar. Girls who reached a certain age, 15, 16, would be chosen for special placement. They'd disappear for weekends, sometimes weeks, come back different, quieter, broken in ways I didn't understand then. Dean's fingers had stopped moving on his tablet. Even Silas had shifted position by the door. His attention focused entirely on Vivi's words. Matron Beatrice administered the marks, Vivi continued. The brands. She called them seals of belonging. Said they meant we were chosen, that we'd always have a home. Always have someone who knew our value. She touched her wrist through her sleeve. I was 7 when she gave me mine. Too young for placement, she said, but marked for the future. Jesus Christ. Dean's voice was barely a whisper. Julian's expression had gone cold, deadly. He was trafficking children. I didn't know that's what it was. Not then, I thought. Vivi's voice cracked. I thought I was lucky to be there, that Thorne was saving us from worse fates. He was so kind, so paternal. He'd call me my little scholar, tell me I was destined for important things. She turned from the window, finally meeting Julian's eyes. When I aged out, he offered me a position. Said he had connections, could set me up with a mentor. A man named Charles Grant. Dean's head snapped up. Senator Charles Grant? I don't know. Maybe. I never took the offer. Something felt wrong. So I ran. Changed my name, built a new life. Convinced myself I'd escaped. But what Dean was about to discover would prove that no one ever truly escaped the gilded cage. They were just moved to different rooms. Julian exchanged a look with Dean, some silent communication passing between them. Dean's fingers flew across his tablet, pulling up new files. Charles Grant, Dean said slowly, has been a senator for 15 years, sits on the Committee for Child Welfare and Protection Services, major donor to dozens of nonprofits serving at-risk youth. He looked up, his face pale. And Elias Thorne has been his special advisor on youth outreach for the past decade. The silence that followed was suffocating. Anya was investigating Grant, Julian said quietly, pieces falling into place behind his eyes. She told me she'd found something that connected him to a network, something she called the Gilded Cage. Said it was trafficking hidden in plain sight, protected by money and political power. I thought she was being paranoid. She wasn't, Vivi whispered. Dean was still scrolling, his expression growing more grim with each swipe. Grant has a private foundation. New Beginnings for Forgotten Children. Tax filings show millions in donations, but the money trail goes cold after it enters the foundation. No clear record of where it's distributed. Because it's not going to children, Julian said, his voice lethal with certainty. It's payment. For merchandise. Vivi's stomach turned. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself, the bourbon threatening to come back up. The girls who disappeared from St. Jude's, she said, forcing the words out. The ones Dean can't find. They're not missing. They're placed. That's what Thorne does. He finds girls no one's looking for. Girls the system has already failed. And he prepares them. Teaches them to be exactly what wealthy, powerful men want. And then he brands them, Julian finished, his gaze dropping to her wrist. So his clients know they're authentic. Certified. Property. The word hung in the air like poison. Mrs. Dwyer appeared in the doorway, drawn by the silence or perhaps by instinct. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in front of her. Mr. Holt, she said softly. The guest room is prepared. Perhaps Ms. Reed would like to rest. No! Vivi's voice was stronger now, anger burning through the nausea. No rest. If Thorne sent me that letter, if he knows I'm here... She looked at Julian. Your wife found something. Something worth killing for. If I'm going to help you, I need to see everything she had. Everything you've found. Julian studied her for a long moment, weighing risks, calculating odds. Finally, he nodded. Dean, pull up the encrypted files. The ones Anya hid in the cloud. He moved closer to Vivi, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. Fair warning. What you're about to see, there's no coming back from it. Once you know, you're in this. Completely. Vivi thought of the 7-year-old girl screaming in a basement chapel, of the 18 years spent looking over her shoulder, of Anya's blood-soaked warning and the red ribbon that tied them all together. I've been in this since I was 7 years old, she said. I just didn't know it had a name. Julian's expression softened, just for a moment. Then the steel returned. The Gilded Cage, he said. That's what Anya called it. And we're going to tear it apart. What they were about to discover would prove that the cage wasn't just gilded. It was reinforced by the most powerful people in the country. And breaking it would require a sacrifice none of them were prepared to make. The files arrived in waves, encrypted folders that Dean unlocked with the kind of reverence usually reserved for archaeological sites. Each click revealed another layer of Anya Holt's final investigation, months of work condensed into digital breadcrumbs that she'd scattered across cloud servers and hidden accounts. Insurance against the violence she must have known was coming. Vivi had claimed the other side of Julian's massive desk, her curator's training kicking in as she organized the chaos into something she could parse. Photographs in one stack, financial documents in another, interview transcripts arranged by date. Dean worked the digital side, pulling metadata and cross-referencing timestamps while Julian paced behind them like a caged animal, too restless to sit but too invested to leave. It was past midnight when Vivi found the first anomaly. This doesn't make sense, she said, holding up a photograph of a painting, a mediocre still life of fruit and flowers that belonged in a hotel lobby, not an investigative file. Why would Anya photograph this? Dean glanced over, adjusting his glasses. Location data puts it in Senator Grant's private office. She must have taken it during one of his fundraisers. But it's worthless. Bad composition, amateur technique. No curator would give it a second look. Vivi tilted the photo, studying the angle. Unless that's the point. Julian stopped pacing. Explain. Anya was a journalist, but she knew enough about art to marry into your world. Vivi pulled her laptop closer, opening image editing software. If I wanted to hide something from people who weren't looking closely, who just saw another boring painting, I'd hide it in plain sight. What Vivi was about to uncover would reveal that Anya hadn't just documented the network. She'd mapped every single player, hidden in artwork they saw every day but never truly looked at. She zoomed in on the painting's frame, then the wall behind it, then the reflection in the glass protecting the canvas. Nothing. But when she adjusted the contrast, letters emerged from the painted flowers. So subtle they could have been brushstrokes, almost invisible unless you knew to look. Matthew 18:6, Vivi read aloud. Dean was already pulling up a Bible search. Whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. The room went silent. She was sending a message, Julian said quietly, to anyone who found her research. This isn't just investigation. It's testimony. Vivi's hands moved faster now, pulling up more photographs. A sculpture in Grant's reception area. Initials carved into the base. Invisible unless you knew to zoom in. A decorative mirror with coordinates etched along the frame's edge. A bookshelf where certain spines, when read vertically, spelled out names. She encoded everything, Vivi breathed. Every piece of evidence, every connection. She hid it in the artwork and architecture around them, places they'd never think to look because they saw these things every day. Dean was typing furiously, compiling the data. I'm cross-referencing the coordinates now. They point to properties, warehouses, private residences, offshore accounts. This is the network. She mapped the entire operation. But Vivi had stopped listening. She'd found another file, this one labeled simply Lily. And when she opened it, her breath caught. It was a children's book. Photographed page by page, the images crisp enough to read every word. The Garden of Good Children, by an author Vivi had never heard of, published by a press that probably didn't exist. The illustrations were typical Victorian-era saccharine, rosy-cheeked children playing in a walled garden, tending flowers, reading beneath trees. Except the children all had the same eyes. Dead eyes. And if you looked closely, very closely, you could see the faint circular scars on their wrists. Jesus, Dean whispered, leaning over to see Patty. The truth hidden in this children's book was more horrifying than anything they'd imagined. It wasn't just evidence. It was an instruction manual. Vivi turned the pages slowly, her curator's eye catching details that made her stomach clench. The garden wall had symbols carved into the stones, the same symbols she'd seen burned into the basement walls of St. Jude's. The flowers the children tended were all red, ribbon-tied at their stems. And in the background of every illustration, barely visible, was a man in a dark suit watching from a window. The same face. Over and over. That's Thorne, she said. Julian moved closer, his hand gripping the back of her chair. Why would Anya have this? Because it's not a children's book. Vivi flipped to the last page, where a rhyme was printed in ornate script. It's a ledger, or instructions, or both. She read aloud, her voice steady despite the ice spreading through her chest. When the shepherd counts his fold at night and tallies each small lamb's delight, seek the window where saints convene, where crimson light makes silver clean. 12 above and 7 below, the names of those who reap and sow. Dean was already moving, pulling up building schematics on his tablet. Window where saints convene. Stained glass. Has to be. Crimson light. Red glass. Silver clean. Could be names. Could be. Senator Grant's building, Vivi interrupted, her mind racing through every image Anya had captured. The Capitol Office building. There's a private chapel on the 7th floor, used for prayer breakfasts and closed-door meetings. I remember reading about it in an architectural journal, commissioned stained glass from a European artist in the 1920s. How would you remember that? Julian asked. Because the artist was known for hidden imagery, Catholic symbolism layered over pagan motifs. Collectors pay fortunes for his work because of the secrets embedded in the glass. Vivi pulled up her own archives, searching through academic papers she'd saved years ago. Here, The Communion of Saints by Friedrich Kellerman, installed in 1924, 12 apostles in the upper register, 7 virtues below. Dean's fingers flew across his keyboard, hacking into databases that definitely required federal clearance. Got it. The chapel is registered as a historic landmark, maintained by a private foundation. Want to guess who sits on the board? Thorne, Julian said. And Grant. And 5 other names that appear in Anya's files as donors to New Beginnings for Forgotten Children. Dean zoomed in on the architectural plans. The window faces east, catches morning light. If there's something hidden in the glass, names, numbers, whatever, it would only be visible at certain times of day. Crimson light makes silver clean, Vivi repeated. Silver could be literal. Silver nitrate was used in old stained glass to create certain colors. If someone had etched names into the silver-stained sections, you'd need red light shining through to make them visible. A client list, Julian said, his voice deadly calm. Hidden in a chapel window where only the right people would know to look. Permanent. Untraceable to any database. And perfectly in character for men who see themselves as untouchable. Vivi turned back to the children's book, studying the illustrations with new horror. Each child in the garden was positioned beneath a different flower. Roses, lilies, violets, and each flower had a number painted subtly into its petals. It's not just a list, she said quietly. It's an inventory. The flowers correspond to the girls. The numbers are their prices. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Dean's sharp intake of breath and Julian's hand slamming down on the desk hard enough to make the bourbon glasses jump. But what none of them knew was that accessing that window would require walking directly into Thorne's trap. And he'd been preparing it since the moment Vivi wore that ribbon. How do we access it? Julian's voice was controlled. But violence simmered beneath every word. The chapel, the window. How do we get in? Dean was already pulling up security protocols. Private building, keycard access, cameras on every floor. We'd need someone with clearance, and even then... Grant hosts a monthly prayer breakfast, Vivi interrupted, her mind clicking through society pages and political calendars she'd skimmed over the years. Invitation only, donors, advisors, selected constituents. It's tomorrow morning. Julian's eyes met hers. Can you get us in? I'm a curator with connections to the art world. If I reached out to Grant's office, said I was researching Kellerman's work for an exhibition. She paused, weighing the risk. It's thin, but it might work. It has to work. Julian pulled out his phone, already texting someone. Silas will handle logistics. Dean, I need full backgrounds on everyone who'll be in that building tomorrow. Exits, guard rotations, communication blackout protocols. What about Thorne? Dean asked. If he's watching Vivi, he'll know the moment she surfaces. Good, Julian said coldly. Let him know. Let him wonder what she's planning. Maybe it'll make him sloppy. Vivi's hand drifted to her wrist, to the scar hidden beneath her sleeve. She thought about Anya, encoding justice into artwork because she knew the system wouldn't protect her. About the girls in the illustrated garden with their dead eyes and numbered flowers. About the red ribbon that had marked her since childhood as someone's property. She pulled the ribbon from her pocket, letting it pool across Anya's encrypted files like a declaration of war. I'll make the call in the morning, she said. But I'm going in alone. If this goes wrong, you need plausible deniability. No. Julian's response was immediate. Yes. Vivi met his gaze without flinching. Because if Thorne is there, he'll only talk to me. He thinks I'm still his, still marked, still belonging. Her smile was sharp enough to cut. Let's see what happens when the merchandise talks back. But before the prayer breakfast could happen, they would need to survive the night. And Thorne had already sent someone to make sure they didn't. Gabe Chavez lived in a walk-up in Brooklyn that smelled of curry and stale cigarettes, the kind of building where neighbors minded their business and security cameras had stopped working years ago. Dean had found him buried in Anya's encrypted contacts. A former social worker who'd worked the foster care circuit before his license was mysteriously revoked. Anya's note said he'd been trying to expose irregularities in youth placements when he'd stumbled onto something bigger. Something that had cost him his career and sent him underground. Julian had insisted on coming despite Vivi's objections. Silas drove them in an unmarked sedan, taking a route through the city that doubled back twice and passed through 3 tunnels. Standard counter-surveillance that made Vivi's stomach knot with the reality of what they were walking into. Dean stayed behind, monitoring communications and running interference on any digital traces they might leave. It was barely dawn when they climbed the narrow stairs to the 4th floor. The building creaking around them like something dying slowly. Julian moved with the fluid certainty of someone comfortable with violence, his hand resting casually near his jacket, where Vivi knew he kept a gun. Silas took point, his silver hair and grandfather's face doing nothing to disguise the predator underneath. Apartment 4C. The door was already ajar. Julian's hand shot out, stopping Vivi before she could knock. He exchanged a look with Silas, some silent language of men who'd walked into traps before. Silas pushed the door open slowly, gun drawn, while Julian pulled Vivi behind him with his free hand. They were already too late, but what Gabe would reveal with his dying breath would change everything. The apartment was small, cluttered with the kind of organized chaos that came from obsession. Papers covered every surface. Photographs pinned to walls with red string connecting faces and places. A laptop sat open on a card table, screen dark. The air smelled wrong, copper and fear and something chemical that made Vivi's eyes water. Clear, Silas said quietly, moving through the tiny space with professional efficiency. But someone was here, recently. Julian released Vivi's arm, his attention fixed on the walls. Anya's face stared back at them from a dozen photographs, at fundraisers, outside government buildings, captured in the background of society events. And beside her images, connected by blood-red string, were photos of girls. Young women. Some Vivi recognized from St. Jude's, others she'd never seen. All with the same haunted eyes. He's been tracking it, Vivi breathed. The whole network. Ms. Reed. The voice came from the bedroom doorway. Barely a whisper. A man stood there, mid-40s, gaunt, with the kind of exhaustion that lived in bones. His shirt was dark with blood, spreading from his abdomen where his hand pressed uselessly against the wound. Gabe Chavez. Already dying. Julian moved first, catching him before he collapsed, lowering him carefully to the floor. Silas was on his phone immediately, calling for extraction. But Vivi could see from the amount of blood that it was already too late. She dropped to her knees beside them, her hands hovering uselessly over the wound. "Don't," Gabe said, his breathing shallow. "Doesn't matter. They knew you'd come. Knew I'd talk." His eyes found Vivi's face, widening with something like recognition. "You're one of the girls, from the home." "St. Jude's," Vivi confirmed. "I'm trying to stop them." "Good." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Anya tried. God, she tried so hard. Found everything. The gilded cage, that's what they call it. Network spans 12 states. Hundreds of girls. They don't just traffic them. They train them, place them, like your seeds being planted in rich soil." "Grant," Julian said urgently. "Senator Grant. What's his role?" Gabe's laugh was wet, broken. "He's not just a client. He's the broker. Takes the girls Thorne prepares and matches them to buyers. Politicians, CEOs, foreign dignitaries. Anyone with money and the right moral bankruptcy." His hand found Vivi's wrist, gripping weakly. "The window. Anya said you'd understand about the window. The names. They're not just clients. They're partners. People who invested in the network. Who own shares in—" He convulsed, blood bubbling from his mouth. "Stay with us," Julian commanded, his voice sharp. "What else? What couldn't you tell Anya?" What Gabe was about to reveal would expose the traitor in Julian's inner circle, the one person they'd all trusted. "Thorne has someone inside your organization," Gabe whispered. "Someone close. That's how they found Anya. How they always know." His eyes went unfocused, staring at something beyond them. "I'm sorry. I should have been braver. Should have gone on record. But they threatened my daughter and I." "Where's your daughter now?" Vivi asked gently. "Safe. Overseas. Changed name, like you did." His grip tightened one last time. "The prayer breakfast. Tomorrow. It's not just breakfast, it's an auction preview. New merchandise. Thorne will be there. He's bringing someone. A demonstration for potential investors." Vivi's blood went cold. "Who?" But Gabe's eyes had already gone vacant, his hand falling away from her wrist. The silence that followed was broken by footsteps on the stairs, multiple sets, moving fast. Silas was at the window immediately, swearing under his breath. 2 vehicles, 6 men, armed. "Thorne?" Julian asked. "Or Grant's cleanup crew?" Silas was already pulling a secondary weapon. "Fire escape is blocked. 1 exit." Julian's jaw tightened. He looked at Gabe's body, at the walls covered in evidence, at Vivi's pale face. Then he pulled a small device from his pocket, the kind that looked like a phone charger but wasn't, and plugged it into Gabe's laptop. "Dean's remote access," he explained, fingers flying over the keys. "If Gabe documented what he knew, we need it now." The footsteps were on the 3rd floor. Vivi could hear voices, professional, calm. The tone of men who did this for a living. 30 seconds, Silas warned. "Got it." Julian pulled the device free, pocketing it. Then he did something Vivi didn't expect. He pulled out a lighter, flicked it once, and held it to the papers on the nearest wall. "Can't let them erase him. If we don't make it out, at least there's evidence something was here." The fire caught quickly, spreading across the conspiracy walls with hungry efficiency. Smoke began to fill the room. "Now," Silas said. The next 60 seconds would determine if they lived to see the prayer breakfast, or if Thorne's men would finish what they'd started with Gabe. They moved as one, Julian pulling Vivi toward the door while Silas provided cover. The hallway erupted in noise, men shouting, doors slamming. Gunfire cracked, deafening in the narrow space. Silas returned fire. His movements economical and precise, while Julian shielded Vivi with his body and pushed toward the stairs. A man in a black tactical vest appeared at the landing. Julian didn't hesitate. 2 shots, center mass, and the man went down. Vivi's ears were ringing, her breath coming in gasps, but her legs kept moving because Julian's hand was iron on her arm, and stopping meant dying. They burst onto the street into chaos. Residents were emerging from buildings, drawn by the fire alarm that someone had pulled. Silas had the car running, double parked with the passenger door open. Julian shoved Vivi into the back seat, sliding in beside her as Silas punched the accelerator. Behind them, Gabe's apartment building was already smoking, flames visible in the 4th-floor windows. Sirens wailed in the distance. And somewhere in that burning building was evidence of a network that spanned 12 states and destroyed hundreds of lives. Julian's phone buzzed. Dean's voice came through tight and controlled. "Got the upload. Gabe's files are secure. But boss, we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "I ran the names from Gabe's database against your staff. Cross-referenced communication patterns, access logs, financial records." Dean paused. "Mrs. Dwyer received a wire transfer 2 days ago. $50,000 from an offshore account owned by a shell company. The same company that pays Thorne's pension." The car went silent except for the sound of New York traffic and Vivi's ragged breathing. "Mrs. Dwyer," Julian said slowly, his voice empty of inflection, "has been with my family for 15 years. "I'm sorry," Dean said. "But the data doesn't lie. She's been reporting to them, which means they know everything. Your security protocols, your investigation, your plans for tomorrow." The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet, but it also gave them something Thorne didn't expect: the ability to feed him exactly what they wanted him to believe. Julian's hand found Vivi's in the darkness of the back seat, gripping hard enough to hurt. "Then we changed the plan," he said quietly. "Because if Thorne thinks he knows what we're doing, we'll do something else entirely." Vivi thought about Gabe bleeding out on his floor, about Anya dead for knowing too much, about Mrs. Dwyer's kind face hiding betrayal, about the prayer breakfast tomorrow, and the demonstration Gabe had mentioned with his dying breath. "What if we don't need to break into the chapel?" she said. "What if they invite us in?" Julian's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "Explain." "Gabe said it's an auction preview, new merchandise, a demonstration." Vivi's voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "What if the merchandise volunteers?" "They didn't go back to the estate." "Too compromised," Julian said. "Too many eyes." Instead, Silas drove them to a safe house in Queens, a nondescript brownstone that looked like every other building on the block, but had reinforced doors and a basement armory that could outfit a small military unit. Vivi sat in the kitchen while Julian swept the rooms for surveillance devices that shouldn't exist but might anyway, her hands wrapped around coffee she couldn't taste. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came after violence. Her ears still rang from the gunfire. Her clothes smelled of smoke and Gabe's blood. A man had died because he'd tried to help them, because he'd known too much, because she'd existed. The red ribbon sat on the table in front of her, the silk somehow still pristine despite everything. She'd pulled it from her pocket without thinking, letting it unspool across the scarred wood like evidence at a crime scene. In the harsh kitchen light, it looked less like a warning and more like what it was: a mark of ownership. A leash made beautiful. "You should rest," Julian said from the doorway. He'd removed his jacket, rolled his sleeves to his elbows. There was blood on his shirt cuff, Gabe's or the man on the stairs, she didn't know. "We have 8 hours before the prayer breakfast. You need to be sharp." "I need to understand." Vivi's voice was raw. "Gabe said Anya left the photograph with the ribbon, that it was her last message. But where did she get it? How did she know to tie it exactly like... She gestured to the ribbon. Like this? Julian was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat, his hands flat on the table like he was steadying himself against something. Anya didn't die at home, he said quietly. The official report said home invasion, but that was a cover. She was found in a hotel room downtown, the Ashford, room 712. His jaw tightened. She'd checked in under a false name 3 days earlier, paid cash, told the front desk she needed absolute privacy for research. She was hiding. From me, from everyone. Julian's eyes were hollow. The last time I saw her alive, we fought. She wanted to publish what she'd found about Grant and Thorne. I told her it was too dangerous, that we needed more evidence, better protection. She said I was trying to control her the same way those men controlled the girls. He paused. She wasn't wrong. Vivi waited, letting the silence stretch. What Julian was about to reveal would show just how far Anya had gone to leave her message, and how perfectly she'd predicted Vivi would one day wear that same ribbon. When the police called, they said she'd been dead for at least 12 hours before housekeeping found her. 2 bullets to the chest, close range, professional. But the room... He stopped, his control fracturing for just a moment. The room was staged, made to look like she'd been working when it happened. Laptop open, files scattered, but Anya was meticulous. She never worked like that. What else was there? Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos with the careful movements of someone handling broken glass. He found the image he wanted and turned the screen toward Vivi. The photograph showed Anya's wrist, laid carefully on white sheets. The circular scar was angry red, freshly made, the skin around it bruised purple and yellow, and tied around it with surgical precision was the red ribbon, securing a folded piece of paper. The blood had soaked through, turning the silk dark and sticky. But it was the way the ribbon was tied that made Vivi's breath catch. The exact same bow, the same careful loops, the same deliberate presentation. She branded herself, Vivi whispered. The medical examiner said the burn was self-inflicted. Maybe an hour before she died. Julian's voice was carefully empty. The paper said Thorne, nothing else, just his name. It wasn't suicide. No, she knew they were coming, knew she was out of time. So she left a message in the only language she thought I'd understand. He gestured to the ribbon on the table. When I saw it on your wrist in that lobby, I thought... He stopped, struggling. I thought you were sent by whoever killed her, that you were wearing her warning like a trophy. Vivi picked up the ribbon, letting it slide through her fingers. The silk was cool, impersonal, just fabric. But Matron Beatrice had given it to her with ceremony, with weight. So God always knows his own, she'd said. So you never forget what you are. She didn't get this from Thorne, Vivi said slowly, pieces clicking into place. Anya. She researched the network, found St. Jude's, maybe talked to other survivors. She would have learned about the ribbons, how we were given them when we aged out, how they were supposed to be kept as reminders. Reminders of what? That we belonged to someone, that we could be called back any time. The mark was permanent, but the ribbon... Vivi held it up to the light, seeing it with new eyes. The ribbon was the leash. Matron Beatrice said it was a gift, a blessing, but it was a threat. As long as we kept it, as long as we remembered it existed, we'd never really be free. Julian leaned forward. So when Anya tied it to the brand she gave herself, she was connecting the mark to Thorne, showing you that he was the one who created the system, the one who held the leash. Vivi's hands trembled. But it was more than that. She was defying him, taking the symbol of ownership and turning it into evidence, into testimony. She was saying this is who did it, Julian said. Not just to me, to whoever found her, to history. Vivi thought about Anya in that hotel room, knowing death was coming, using her last hour to document the truth in her own flesh. About the courage it took to burn yourself, to tie the ribbon with steady hands, to leave a message you'd never know was received. I've worn this ribbon exactly twice in my life, Vivi said. The day matron Beatrice gave it to me, and 3 days ago when I got the letter. Both times it felt like putting on chains, like accepting something. What changed 3 days ago? I stopped running. She met his eyes. The letter said, "Welcome home." And I realized I'd spent 18 years looking over my shoulder, building a life small enough that no one would notice me. I was so afraid of being found that I disappeared myself. I did their work for them. You survived. I existed. There's a difference. Vivi stood, moving to the window. Dawn was breaking over Queens, turning the sky the color of a wound. Anya didn't just survive. She fought. She found the truth and she documented it, and when they came for her, she made sure the evidence lived on. She took the mark, this fucking mark. She touched her wrist. And she made it mean something else. Not ownership. Defiance. Julian stood too, joining her at the window. What are you saying? I'm saying the prayer breakfast isn't a trap if we spring it intentionally. If I walk in wearing this ribbon, Thorne will think I'm surrendering. Coming home. He'll want to show me off, proof that his system works, that even the ones who run eventually come back. She turned to face him. And while he's gloating, while he's demonstrating his power to his investors, we'll be documenting everything. Every face in that room, every name behind that window. They'll kill you. The moment they realize, maybe. But they killed Anya for knowing the truth, and look what she left behind. Vivi picked up the ribbon, winding it around her wrist with steady hands. She turned the mark into a message. I'm going to turn it into a weapon. Julian watched her tie the bow, his expression unreadable. Then he reached out, his fingers hovering over the ribbon without quite touching it. Anya was brave, he said quietly. Brave enough that it got her killed. I won't let that happen to you. You don't get a choice. Vivi's voice was gentle, but firm. This stopped being about your revenge the moment I understood what that children's book meant. How many girls are still in the garden, still being tallied and priced and sold? I can't walk away from that. I won't. Then we do it smart. Julian's hand closed around hers, over the ribbon. We go in with backup, with exit strategies, with insurance that if it goes wrong, the evidence still gets out. Agreed. But Julian... She waited until he met her eyes. When we're in that chapel, when Thorne sees me wearing this ribbon, he's going to say things, do things, try to reassert control, and you have to let him. Because the moment he thinks I'm not his, the moment he suspects I'm there as a witness, he'll kill you. Julian's grip tightened. Like he killed Anya. Yes. So I need you to trust me. Trust that I know how to be what they want to see. That I've been performing survival since I was 7 years old. She pulled her hand free, the ribbon bright against her skin. Anya left a message in blood. I'm going to deliver it in person. Outside, the city was waking up. Car horns, distant sirens, the eternal noise of millions of people living on top of each other. Somewhere in that mass, Thorne was preparing for his prayer breakfast. Grant was reviewing his client list, and girls whose names Vivi would never know were being prepared for demonstration, for auction, for lives that would destroy them. The red ribbon sat on her wrist like a declaration of war. 8 hours, Julian said. We plan every detail, every contingency. 7, Vivi corrected, checking her phone. I need an hour to become someone else. Someone they'll recognize. She didn't say what they both knew. That the person she'd have to become was the girl she'd spent 18 years trying to forget. The one who'd learned to smile through pain and curtsy for monsters. The one who'd believed that being chosen was the same as being loved. The one who'd worn this ribbon the first time and thought it was a gift. But what Vivi and Julian didn't know was that Thorn had one more trap waiting. One that would force them to choose between exposing the network and saving an innocent life. And the clock was already ticking. The air inside the ballroom of Senator Charles Grant's private residence was thick with the scent of old money, expensive champagne, and corruption. Julian Holt and Vivian Reed were the perfect camouflage. The ruthless tycoon attending a political fundraiser, and his quiet, impeccably dressed companion. Julian's hand rested lightly on the small of Vivi's back, but the contact was less affection and more control, a silent pressure guiding her past the nodding politicians and society figures. Beneath the emerald silk of her gown, Vivi felt the familiar, dull throb of the scar on her wrist, now hidden beneath the long cuff but still defined by the memory of the red ribbon. Silas, moving with the fluid, gray professionalism of a predator, gave Julian a minute nod. The senator had just retreated to his private study. This was their window. They broke away from the main party, slipping into the dim, wood-paneled halls that led to Grant's private library. It was here, above the massive fireplace, that the final piece of Anya's puzzle waited. Vivi's breath hitched when she saw it, a towering original piece of Art Deco stained glass, depicting a stylized celestial map. The rhyme, Vivi whispered, her curator's focus instantly sharpening, overriding her fear. Where the morning star touches the lion's heart. It's not a star, Julian, it's a constellation. See that small section? The one that doesn't align with the map? It's a mechanism. Julian only glanced at the intricate glass before looking at Silas. Silas was already there, gloved hands running over the designated section. He pulled a small, innocuous-looking brass pin from his waistcoat, inserted it into a near-invisible seam in the leadwork, and twisted. A low, hydraulic hiss broke the silence, and a section of the massive mahogany bookshelf groaned outward, revealing a black, sealed steel door that swallowed the ambient light. Julian's face went utterly blank, the mask of controlled violence descending fully. "Go," he ordered, his voice barely a breath. What they were about to discover behind that door would prove the Gilded Cage wasn't just a network. It was an empire. And every name they'd been chasing was just middle management. Silas cracked the vault's high-tech lock in seconds. They stepped through into a space that was not a dusty cellar, but a chillingly modern server room, the Gilded Cage's digital core. Elias Thorne stood near the main rack, illuminated by the blinking red and green lights of the servers. He wasn't in robes or a religious habit, but in a tailored dinner jacket, calmly holding a silver briefcase. Beside him, the sweating, utterly terrified Senator Grant was fumbling with a data stick. "Julian," Thorne said, a theatrical sigh escaping him. "I almost admired your wife's persistence. A shame you found another marked curiosity so quickly." He gave Vivi a dismissive, proprietary glance that made her skin crawl. Julian didn't move. His focus was entirely on the man who had ordered Anya's death. "You," Julian stated, his voice flat, emotionless, and terrifyingly cold. "You sent the warning. You tied the ribbon, didn't you? It was your signature." Thorne smiled, a genuine, chilling display of arrogance. Anya was sentimental. She knew the original mark, the scar, was a brand of ownership. She tried to weaponize it, leave a message for a fellow product. When I caught her, I thought it was rather artistic to finish the message myself. A little red ribbon. Finality. Tied up neatly. She was a loose end, Julian. Nothing more. She knew too much about the ledger. She had to go. The confession hung in the air like a noose, but Thorne's arrogance had blinded him to what Vivi was already doing. Vivi heard the confession, the confirmation of the horror, but her eyes were already on the prize. While the two titans of their respective dark worlds locked gazes, she moved. Anya's research hadn't been just about the glass. It was about the system. Vivi knew Thorne's operation was global, and destroying one server wouldn't be enough. She focused on the cooling unit, the central weakness of any large-scale data center. She darted to a small auxiliary panel disguised as a thermostat. Thorne laughed, misinterpreting her movement as a panic-fueled attempt to run. Little Vivi. Still trying to hide? The mark, Vivi said without turning around, her fingers flying across the panel. It means survivor, not product. She smashed a single emergency disconnect with the heel of her hand, a trick she learned from working with aging museum ventilation systems. The immediate alarm was not audible, but physical. The forced, sharp exhalation of the server room's climate control. Thorne's expression finally broke, shifting from smugness to pure fury. The cooling unit, Senator Grant shrieked, finally understanding the danger. She's killing the storage. Stop her. But it was already too late. Dean Archer and two of Julian's men surged in through the vault door, their movements practiced and precise. Julian didn't hesitate. With Thorne's confession echoing in the closed space, he moved. Silas intercepted the senator, who went down with a pathetic whimper. Julian, fueled by 18 months of cold grief, drove Thorne back against the metal rack. A loose end, Julian repeated, the word a blade. Thorne was overwhelmed. He was an organizer, not a fighter. As the server room began to heat and the critical data began to fail, Julian's team secured the crucial physical servers that housed the mirrored ledgers and the client files. It's done, Julian, Silas said, pinning the thrashing Thorne to the floor. We have the books and the senator. Vivi leaned against the humming, overheating rack, watching the finality of the arrests. The air in the room was stifling, the glare of the warning lights overwhelming. But for the first time in years, the mark on her wrist didn't feel like a brand of shame. It felt like a battle scar, finally earned. The vengeance was cold, precise, and utterly complete. But even with Thorne and Grant in custody, the true architects of the Gilded Cage remained free. This was just the beginning. The collapse of the Gilded Cage was not a sudden explosion, but a grinding, systemic failure, exposed by the digital ledgers Julian's team had extracted from the overheated vault. Within 48 hours, Director Elias Thorne and Senator Charles Grant, along with a dozen mid-level associates, were in custody. The news headlines were a frenzy of shock and denial. The high-gloss world of political charity stripped away to reveal a horrific branded commerce beneath. Julian, through Silas and Dean, fed the information carefully, just enough to ensure the arrests stuck, and just little enough to protect the fragile, traumatized Vivi. But the justice felt cold. It was the sterile, inevitable end of a long hunt, and it lacked the warmth of true resolution. 2 days later, Julian drove Vivi to a quiet cemetery outside the city. It was a crisp, clear afternoon, the kind of stillness that felt like a judgment. They stood before Anya Holt's stone, which was simple, elegant, and bore no excessive sentiment. Vivi shifted, her body still wired from the adrenaline of the confrontation. She hadn't slept well, the memory of Thorne's proprietary smile and the sound of the overheated servers still buzzing in her head. She finally spoke, her voice raspy from disuse. It was never just about a scar, she said, looking at the stone, then at Julian. It was about what that mark meant. Thorne saw us, me, Anya, all of us, as objects to be marketed, things he owned. He used the mark because it symbolized his power over us. Julian stared at the inscription on the stone. He hadn't realized how completely his vengeance had consumed him until the threat was gone. He had pursued justice for a symbol, the identical scar, but he had been blind to the emotional truth it represented. "I was chasing a ghost," Julian admitted, his voice rough. This was the most honest, unmasked thing Vivi had ever heard him say. He wasn't the mafia boss or the tycoon now. He was a grieving husband. "I needed to find the man who killed my wife. I thought when I found him the rage would stop. It hasn't. It's just quieter now." He finally turned to Vivi, the remnants of the cold, controlling man melting away to reveal the exhaustion beneath. He saw not a pawn, but the fiercely intelligent woman who had kept her head while he was consumed by fury, the curator who had saved the evidence while he was preoccupied with the kill. "You didn't just retrieve the ledgers, Vivi," he continued, his gaze intense. "You understood the system. You destroyed their primary infrastructure while ensuring we had the proof we needed. Anya started this fight, but you finished this chapter. You saved me from an endless, blind rage because you gave me a win. A real one." Vivi took a slow breath, absorbing his words. He recognized her strength. He recognized the survivor, not the victim. The scar, no longer tied with the defiant red ribbon, felt different. Lighter. She reached up and touched the smooth, expensive fabric of the suit jacket he wore. "The network is international, Julian. Grant was just a client. Thorne had franchises, you know that. And Anya knew that too." She paused, the full crushing weight of their shared trauma settling between them. The rage doesn't stop because the evil doesn't stop. It just changes form. They stood there for several more minutes, side by side, recognizing in each other a dangerous clarity. The fight was over, but the war, Vivi knew, was just beginning. The question was what to do with the tools, the access, the power, and the shared, unquenchable fire of justice that Anya had left behind. They had avenged her, but they hadn't honored her mission. Not yet. The quiet estate felt heavy with possibility. The arrests had cleared the immediate landscape, but the silence now left a void. Julian, standing in his study overlooking the city, watched Vivi as she carefully untied the faded red ribbon from her scarred wrist. It was the same ribbon he'd seen in Anya's final message, the silent scream of defiance that had been their roadmap to Thorne. The removal was deliberate. The scar, a faint circular indentation, was now exposed, a piece of healed, painful history. She didn't look at it with revulsion, but with an odd, fierce neutrality. Julian finally broke the silence. "What will you do now, Vivi? Go back to the museum? To the quiet you wanted?" Vivi turned, holding the soft crimson satin between her thumb and forefinger. "And pretend the last 18 years of silence didn't happen? That I didn't just dismantle an operation that branded children for sale? That Thorne isn't merely the first head of a sprawling hydra?" Her curator's life felt impossibly small, a delicate, boring lie she could no longer inhabit. She walked towards him, her gaze meeting his with unflinching equality, the look of a true partner, not a frightened survivor. "Anya started a war, Julian. I'm not running from it again. Thorne was right. The scar meant ownership, but the ribbon was Anya's answer to that. Her vow." Julian watched her approach, a man accustomed to having his world calculated and controlled, now facing an unknown variable he couldn't predict, only respect. Vivi reached his wrist, where a heavy, complicated watch marked time in his dangerous world. She carefully, methodically, tied the faded red ribbon around the leather strap, knotting it tightly, deliberately. It was a transfer of purpose, a silent, profound commitment. "Your resources, Julian, can touch the global market in a way the police can't. Your power doesn't just end things, it starts them. She tapped his watch. I know the art, the symbols, the language of the cage. I know how to find the franchise's thorn left behind. We don't owe Anya justice, Julian. We owe her the finish line. The red ribbon, now a stark, vibrant contrast against the expensive black leather and steel of his watch, was no longer a warning or a symbol of trauma. It was a flag. Julian looked from the ribbon to Vivi's eyes, a rare, complex expression softening the hard lines around his mouth. The partnership was not built on love or romance. It was forged in shared trauma, cold vengeance, and a mutual need to fill the void Anya had left behind. The network is vast, Julian cautioned, letting the weight of the enterprise settle on her. It won't be quiet. It won't be safe. Vivi smiled, a small, dangerous curve of her lips that Julian realized was closer to Anya's fierce determination than anything he had ever seen. I stopped being safe the moment you saw the red ribbon scar. I choose to be dangerous now. He took her hand, his thumb resting gently, possessively, over the scar she had just unveiled. It was a silent acceptance of the new terms. The tycoon and the curator, the mafia boss and the survivor, had become something else entirely. A dangerous, unified force, bound by a scarlet vow to hunt down every last gilded cage until the market was empty and the marks were meaningless. The war had just begun. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this. Comment where you're watching from. I love knowing this story found you. And share this with someone who needs to hear that choosing love, even dangerous love, can be the bravest thing you ever do. Thanks for being here.